First of all, a reality check. I have a very big screen. Usually you guys have smaller screens than I do because you're on laptops. I would like to verify that you can see everything from the file menu, if I drop it down in the upper left-hand corner, to this little widget on the bottom that if I click it, it changes how the bottom of the screen looks. Can you both see that?
Mhm. Yeah, I can.
Okay. Okay, good. So you probably have noticed by now that when you open up CLion, it'll open up the last project you're working on. And one of the things that just to make life easier is if you want a different project, I just had somebody in here and didn't know about this. There's an open recent option in the file menu, and that would allow you to go back and forth between any of the projects that you've been working on recently. And that's a little easier way to open a project than any of the other ones. So I always use open recent to go back to my projects I'm working on. Let's see. I know at least one of you has figured out how to set the theme, but one of the things about this development environment is it's highly configurable, and how you configure it is through your settings. And one of the really basic options that people have and that they like to work with is to change their theme. So this settings dialog has so many options, it probably has several hundred options, that it not only has this organization with an outline over here on the left, but it also has a search feature of its own. So if you can't remember how to get to the theme setting dialog, you can just type in the word theme, and you'll either get a list of places where that word appears, or in this case, the only place where theme appears is in this UI options theme dialog. And this version of this package only has 3 themes, and it's really 2 very different choices. So I think it comes probably with either the Windows or the IntelliJ theme as the default. I like Darkula, which has the dark background and the bright colors, but you can see the difference. If I hit apply, you can see that the background becomes light, and the colors don't change an enormous amount. I think it's, at least on my screen, that's quite a bit harder on the eyes to stare at. And Windows is quite similar to IntelliJ, maybe not quite so bright, but I like the Darkula one. So it's entirely a matter of personal preference. Okay, but this is just one of the many settings that you have. Okay. I assume, having done an assignment, you have figured out that if you have an error in your code, several things happen. So this code is right, and there's a little green checkbox up here, okay, and there are no little red lines down here. Now, if I intentionally make an error, like leave the semicolon off a line, okay, a couple of things happen. This green probably is just telling me that line changed. If I hover over the red mark, it's actually giving me very specific advice about what to fix. You'll find that sometimes that's right and sometimes it's wrong, but it's not a bad first place to look at. Okay. What's happening with a compiled language like this is that the IDE is doing a combination of its own evaluation of the lines in your code and also recompiling it. And you can get, and that happens about every 300 milliseconds. If you find that your UI is hanging on you, and it seems like you're typing along, and then every once in a while the UI just kind of drags to a halt for a little bit and then comes back to life, you may find that on your machine that recompiling and reevaluating is a little bit heavyweight, and that you may want it to be happening, say, every second instead of every third of a second. And that's another setting that you can find in the UI. If you feel like your reevaluation from the IDE is dragging down your machine performance, put a note in the discussion board, and I'll figure out the right setting for you to change, and then everybody will know it. It's not one that I've changed recently. Trying to think. I think I'm going to go to my courses. And one of the options you have is you can have two projects open at once. So in particular, as we go along the semester and you're looking at trying to remember from an old project what you did, or even borrow code from an old project to use in a new project, which will become appropriate at various times, you can have both projects open on your screen and switch back and forth. In this case, I'm going to just open my new project in this same window. And let's just talk about compiler errors. Some things are pretty obvious, and the IDE gives you great feedback, okay? Some things, like if you typed, you forgot exactly how to do this and typed in the word standard, okay? And everything turning red at once, including little red marks over here to the right and that, and everything here red, doesn't give you enough of a hint. If you either build your code or you try to run your code, you'll get a series of compiler errors. And as your projects get bigger, what you'll probably find is that you get, you can often get 100 compiler errors from one error. So one of the important things to do with these compiled languages is make sure that you fix the first thing and then try to rerun it, because you'll often find that the first error so throws off the evaluation of all the rest of your code that it makes it look like it's a total disaster when it's really not. So if I just go back and I look at this line, it says standard is not a namespace name. And then there are all sorts of things about not being declared. But if you just go back and fix the very first problem, then all those other problems go away. Okay. Did either of you have any problems when you were working on my courses that it was hard to figure out where the error was?
Not really. No.
Okay.
Not really.
Good. Okay. One feature you should know about is local history. Sometimes you're coding along and everything's going fine, and then you make some changes. You need to make them in 2 or 3 places, and your code gets so wrapped around the axle that it just seems like everything's broken, and you wish that you could go back to where you were at the beginning of the day or an hour ago or whatever. And the truth is, with this software, with a modern IDE, you can. So this is a feature in Cloud 9, but it actually is a much better feature here. It's a much easier one to use. Over here so I'm working on main.cpp, and if I right-click on it, okay, and I look for the local history option, I can have it show me all the history. And basically what that does is it shows you everything from when you first created the file to every change you've ever made. So for example, I must have done something pretty strange at the beginning of this, but when you create a new project, it always says hello world. And this shows me that I added over here, this is what's called a diff, a difference, a diff. And diffs are really useful if you know how to read them. So the code on January 8th is over here on the left. And the code that I have today is over here on the right. And what that shows me is that I added these 2 lines, 3 and 4, with this namespace line. And then I added all of these other lines and substituted them for this one standard outline over here. And basically you can follow the progress of your code as I was, in this case, as I was working out the various things I wanted to do here. I don't think I had a header line until fairly late in the process. But this, I guess I did it the other way. I had the header line. I believe that that local file is only saved when you actually explicitly save your code. It isn't every time it's evaluated. So it does make sense to go in and do an actual file save on a fairly regular basis so that you have a nice detailed history of all your code changes. In order to show you the view organization features of the IDE, we need a little bit more complicated code. So I'm going to go give you a preview of what's going to be in the week 3 exercise. And that is a project called, well, it's the Chapter 3D project. And I think you've all read the system maintenance, yeah, it's in the first chapter, that the system maintenance guidelines from the textbook say one of the most important things to do when you get code to maintain is figure out what to ignore and which things you need to look at and which things you should be not worried about. So when you get your week 3 assignment, what you're going to find is that that is a fairly large file. It has 258 lines of code, okay, which could seem pretty overwhelming if you think you need to understand every line of code. But one of the things that you want to do when you get a new piece of code is A, make sure you've read all the slides so that you know what to not worry about from the point of view of what you're trying not to accomplish or not change, okay? And you want to go down here and take a look at some of the comments. I will try very hard to comment my code. There is a to-do view, which you may have to open the first time you want to look at it. You may have to open it by going up to View, Tool Windows, To Do. But when you get the instructions for week 3, one of the things it's going to say is look in the code for the lines that say to do, and they have a particular number. And you can actually, the IDE treats to-do lines in a special way and isolates them in this window. So you can just click on the to-dos and go through and look at just the areas where I have left a note about something that you are supposed to do at approximately that place. A couple of other things that I think are not visible by default. I believe project is visible by default. Do you guys remember when you open up your IDE, you see this tree control over here on the right by default, correct?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So there are a lot of other views. One that I think is really useful is structure. And when you first open up structure, you'll find that it is on the, I believe that by default, it comes up over here in the same place as project. And you can click on these little tabs and switch back and forth. I have a large enough screen and I use both structure and project often enough that I actually move my structure window to the right and keep it over there. Sometimes I close it, and I keep my project window over here to the left. But what structure does is it basically tells you everything that, it gives you all the defined items, variables, function names, whatever, and allows you to navigate around without necessarily worrying about exactly what line you're on right now and where and what line your code is on. There used to be big fights in development teams about how to organize the code. Do you want the functions called by a function underneath them? Do you want everything alphabetical in the file? Does main have to be on top? Should main be at the bottom? And those religious wars have pretty much gone away because we now almost always have some version of this structure diagram. And if I want to look at the main function for this piece of code, all I have to do over here is click on main and I get taken right to it. Okay? And I can see exactly what happens in the main routine. It's a little confusing here because there are two entries for some of these functions. And the first one is the declaration for the function, because it has to be declared before you can use it. And the second one is the definition. And in week 3, one of the things you're going to be doing is going through this code and deciding on some of these declarations that need to be, that you're going to implement. You have a bunch of things you could implement, and you have to decide which ones you're going to do. You can actually tell really easily which ones have been implemented and which haven't. I did 3 of them. So inches to meters has been implemented, and it's implemented and it's used. So I believe the gold color is because it's used someplace, and I believe you can tell it's been implemented because there's this little definition. So you can go from the declaration to the definition and back again. And then you can also find places where it's been used in the code, and you'll find that this function is used both in a routine called calculate and output conversions, and also in 3 places in a routine called SelfTest, because this code not only has a normal mode where you enter data and it gives you answers, it also has a self-test mode, and you'll have to write new tests for that. That may be a little more information than you need for code you haven't had a chance to look at yet, but I want you to know how configurable the IDE is and how you need to do 2 things. It never hurts to Google around and look at videos, or if you're finding something that seems really difficult as you code along, ask me. Sometimes I know how to do things and I forget that not everyone knows how to do them. I try really hard to not do that, but I may assume that you know the same simple way to do something that I know. There will be hard and laborious parts to this, to coding, but finding things and being able to navigate around the code and find where you're supposed to change things is not supposed to be part of the hard part. So you should let me know, ask questions on the discussion board if you're having trouble navigating. A couple of other features, just real quick ones. If you're ever trying to find your code for zipping it, I don't think that's going to be a problem after the first couple of weeks. But one of the things that happens is you open one project at a time in the IDE, but those projects are all in your week 2 or your week 3 folder, and you can see exactly where they are. Turns out that's a little harder on a Mac. On a Windows, people don't seem to be having trouble finding those. But you can also get you can also see the exact path to this file just simply by hovering over that tab. Any questions? No. Okay. The question came up the other day about why would you simply build your code instead of building and running it? And it's a good question. I think you guys 99% of the time will always run your code, okay? And then see what it does. In this case, if I enter 36 inches, it tells me that it's not quite a meter, which is certainly right. But when you get bigger and bigger projects, simply getting them to build can be quite difficult, especially if you're trying to bring libraries in or get code from someone else. And or builds can take very long. I've worked on projects where simply building the code and getting it ready to run could take easily over an hour. And that means that there are certainly times when you want to build and you don't particularly want to try running the software. One of the documents that that gets introduced in week 3 is a set of coding standards. And one of the points I try to make is that for many of these coding standards, there are CLion settings that can be used to make those things happen automatically. So, for example, it may seem very nitpicky that I always want the else to be on a line by itself, or that I always want to wrap the conditional statement in brackets even if there's only a single one. But however nitpicky it is, you don't particularly have to worry about getting it right yourself if you use the IDE to fix it. So, for example, if I'm typing along and as I type, I put my else on this line and I get my indentation wrong here and I put this bracket down there, all of which are violations of the coding standard. If I have my settings for coding style set correctly, I can simply go through and in this code menu, ask it to reformat my code, and it will implement each of those standards so that you get the bracket at the end of the line, you get the else on the line by itself, it improves the indentation. And you have the option of either simply indenting, which can be helpful by itself, or completely reformatting. So those settings are, again, controlled from this setting menu, and they're in editor, code style, C++, because this editor can code many different kinds of languages. And you'll see the picture in the coding style guide, but one of the things I want you to do is make sure that your if statements place the else on the new line. And you can actually watch the difference happen over here. And let's see if I can do this. Okay. So over here, it's showing what your code would look like if you use that setting, where this else is on the same line as the bracket. And here, if I click this, the else gets moved down to the next line, and it shows you what it changed. One of the things that's optional is that these brackets are optional around a single statement. And that's what this force braces is doing. If I take that off, then you'll see that there are no braces around this. But if I put it back the way I want it, which is we always want to use braces in our if clauses, our while loops and all that, then those braces could put on. So I'm hoping that you find the coding style guidelines useful. What I don't want them to be is taking a huge amount of your time to do a bunch of dweeby little going through your code and hitting the enter button or deleting spaces or any of that. You really, really need to let the IDE do what it's good at, which is if you get the settings correct for the coding guideline, it will make sure that you never get points off for violating the coding guidelines. That's probably about 75% of the coding guidelines. There are other things that the IDE would probably let you get away with and there's no setting for that you're just going to have to watch out for yourself. Like lower camel case variable names, you have to take care of that. The IDE doesn't have a good setting for that. That's about half an hour. I think that's about as much information as anybody can absorb at once. Are there any other questions? I've got one question for each of you, and I'm going to turn off the recording because they have to do specifically with you guys. Does anybody have a question that should be in the general session?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't think so.
Great. I'm going to turn off recording. We'll see if that came through.